Now that we've seen various routing capabilities, I want to show a couple of code organization tactics that you can use. First of all, let's go ahead and get rid of these errors that are in here. It's kind of annoying. But you can see that we have several routes that are just handling this slash username. And we've got to redefine that path in all of our route handlers. And so one way to do that when you've got several handlers is to use the app.route method, and then you give it the path one time in app.route, and then you can just sort of chain all of your handlers off of that. And so we can just say app.route username and then define our all, our get, our put, everything. We'll make sure our app's still working, and yes, it is. Now the next organizational technique is a little more involved, and so we're going to do a little bit of prep work for this. We're going to go ahead and move these utility functions or helper functions that we've created into their own file called helpers.js, and I've already sort of set up the shell of this file so that we're exposing all of those functions from that. And so we'll now go and update all these references in this file so that we can still access these functions. Now that we have that updated, what we're actually going to do, we're actually going to grab all of these handlers and we're going to move them to their own file over here in username.js. And then we're going to re-import Express, and then we're going to call express.router to create our own router instance. By default, Express gives you a router, and that's what we're using when we call, app.get, app.put, those things. But in this case, we're going to create our own instance of a router, and you'll see a lot of times in documentation and things, it's referred to as a mini app because it really is sort of its own self-contained instance. And so once we get everything updated in this file, we've got our access to our helper functions and the FS module, and you can see we're now just updating these routes to be on the router, and you'll notice that the path is just a slash, and that's because when we define this, how our app uses this, we're going to define the path there. So we're actually going to say app.use username, and then we will import our router and say, when you find this username path, I want you to use this router that we're importing here. But now if we go back to the app and use it, you'll see that we're getting an error here, and the error isn't extraordinarily helpful or descriptive, but what's actually going on is that when you create a router like this, it's actually, completely separated, and so it doesn't actually get the URL parameters that we normally do unless we pass in this options object and set merge params to true. So once we do that, we can go back and we see that our app is in fact working. So this allows us to move everything that has to do with username handling into its own file. And in our case, since we're not really doing different paths and things, it's probably not terribly useful, but if you have subpaths in a section of your app, it can be really useful. So if we defined a get handler here for /edit, and we'll just send back some text, but then if we go into our template and redefine this link, the edit link, so that rather than editing in place, it's going to go to /edit, we can then send back our response there. And so you can see how defining those sort of subpaths gets a lot easier and more maintainable if you break things out into their own router file.